We trusted that you would wake us up if that was your will for us to live another day, and you did wake us up, and so apparently it is your will for us not only to live today, but to listen today, to see today, to love today, to understand today, and to thank you for the fullness of life that you have given us today. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. If we were to pass the microphone around this morning and say that you had an unlimited amount of time to describe yourself, during that unlimited time, do you think that you would include an answer to this question? Are you someone who likes change, or do you resist change? You might quickly say in response, well, that depends. What kind of change are you talking about? All of us have developed these capacities to instigate change if we really want it, and then all of us have developed these other capacities to resist change if we don't want it. And we all and there's always opportunities for either or, right? That's just in everyday life. But there are some things in everyday life that it doesn't matter whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. You can't instigate it or resist it. Next Saturday is the first day of fall, the autumnal equinox, when the sun has now moved south and the days will get shorter. Friday is the last day of summer. If you like summer and don't want to change, you can move to Australia because Saturday is the first day of spring in Australia, in the southern hemisphere. So we all know that, right? But here's a little deeper aspect of that question about change. Whether you like it or don't like it, there's another change that happens in our lives that we have no control over, and it's inevitable. And that's the change that happens when someone you really love is no longer alive. Death occurs. And you don't know when that's going to happen. Maybe you anticipate it. But at the hour of death, you have no control over it. Something has changed inevitably. Everyone you love eventually will die, including yourself. Everyone that loves you will, if still alive, will have to change because you're no longer on earth. And so the question is, you can try to resist that. Hopefully you won't try to instigate that at any level. But it's one of those topics that human beings do not like to talk about. And every study shows that, every sociological study. Generally speaking, wherever you go in the world, people are not comfortable with the thought of dying. They want to talk about life, and that's normal, and that's natural. But it's one of those topics that, whether we want to or not, we have to talk about this. It's all in our future at some point. And we're going to come to a portion of the Bible today, John chapter 11. And actually, this is such an important topic that we're going to spend 3 weeks in John chapter 11, because this is really a major part, certainly the first today and next Sunday, and then the end of chapter 11 continues to deal with it. And I hope you'll be here not only for the next 3 Sundays, because this is really crucial stuff, but then in the 2 weeks after that. This ties in so nicely because some of you that were here with us on May 6th, when our good friend Gary Darashinsky. If you weren't, Gary was a man who grew up as an Orthodox Jew, came to faith in Jesus, and now is the leader of a Messianic synagogue out in San Fernando Valley. And so Gary's going to come October 8 and 15, and he's going to talk about, it's the perfect add-on to John chapter 11. He's going to preach on Isaiah chapter 53, because hopefully what you're going to see in the next 3 weeks out of John chapter 11 really is going to give you a deeper understanding, not only of life, but also about death, how to respond to it. And then Isaiah chapter 53, as we're going to see a little bit later this morning, really just creates a whole different level of understanding of this topic and what Jesus' role is in this, all the way back even before the New Testament days. So we're looking forward. These next 5 weeks are going to be really important here at Trinity Baptist, and we hope you can be with us. So if you have your Bibles, John chapter 11, let me just read the first 6 verses. And we're calling this morning, and this is on your outline, a surprising response to life's greatest challenge. It's, I think, going to be surprising. Hopefully you will learn some things that surprise you in a pleasant way. And it really is life's greatest challenge. It really is when you think about it. It's not something that we're always comfortable in talking about. That's why it's a challenge. Now a certain man, verse 1 of chapter 11, was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. First thing that is a surprise when you think about this text, this issue, this great challenge of coping with the change of someone dying in your family. The first thing is what is an apparent indifference on the part of Jesus Christ. It's apparent, and hopefully we're going to see why it's apparent in a moment, but he seems to be indifferent in his response to this news. As we said last week, John chapter 10 ends with him escaping from death threats in Jerusalem. He and his disciples cross over the Jordan. They go back to the location where John the Baptist had originally baptized. So we know just from geography, Jesus is about 90 miles away from the village of Bethany. Was about 2 miles southeast of Jerusalem, a suburb still there. And Jesus is about 150 kilometers, which is about 90 miles away, northeast of Bethany. And this news comes to him. Lazarus, his sister Mary, his sister Martha, and notice that these 2 sisters are informing Jesus of their brother's illness, but it's not a request, is it? Now, what we know from this and other passages, there was a loving relationship with this family. Jesus had a social interaction with them before, and so there's a relationship already, and maybe that's the reason they don't say, "Please come quickly, our brother's sick." Maybe they understand that we know you, you know us, we love you, you love us. All we need to do is just to let you know, and you'll come. That's the basis and the foundation of our relationship. But notice in verse 3, so the sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. That's the first time in John's gospel that this phrase is used of a person the one you love. You all know John 3:16, most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world, the cosmos, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. This is the first time he actually uses this about a specific person. And later on, we'll find out that John himself was known as the one that Jesus loved. But now it's Lazarus is included in this. Now, this introduces something. It's kind of you don't hear this too often. A lot of Bible scholars use these phrases. But this is really crucial to understanding this text. When you and I are willing to think about death, as uncomfortable as that is, especially when it involves a family member, and hopefully we're going to unpack this over the next couple of weeks, and Gary will as well in October. You have to understand it at two levels. When you are trying to understand the meaning of death for a human being, you have to understand it on a cosmological level, and you have to understand it on an historical level. Let me try to unpack that, because that might not be completely clear. Cosmologically, that's John 3:16. And actually, that's the word that's used for world, cosmos. So if you're going to understand death, you have to try to grasp, maybe even in the midst of your own grief, if one of your family members has died recently, and maybe the pain's so great it's hard for you to move beyond historical to cosmological. But over time, as your grief subsides over the loss of a loved one, I think you, as a follower of Christ, you will begin to understand death is bigger than just this historical person that lived from 1933 to 2023 or whatever it is. You know, we put that on tombstones, right? The day of birth, dash, the day of death. And as some have said, the dash is the expression of your life. You're born here, you live, you die here. That's the historical perspective on death. We each have a history. The cosmological understanding of death is more, it leads you more to a discussion of why. Why do people, we know people die. That's the what that happens. What happens? People die. Every human being that's ever been born eventually dies, right? That's the what of death. The cosmological understanding of death is why? Why do people die? And that's what John 3:16 deals with. That's what Isaiah 53 deals with, that we're going to talk about in a few weeks. That's what the whole Genesis chapter 3, when God pronounces the first judgment on Adam and Eve, that's the whole sweep of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. It's a cosmological understanding. But in the graciousness of God, here's this historical person, Lazarus. We don't know when he was born. We think he was a young man. So maybe he was born somewhere around the time that Jesus was. Maybe they're somewhat comparable in age. And God says, I not only love the cosmos, I love Lazarus. And you can be sure this morning that God not only says, I not only love the cosmos, the universe I created, I love you. Just put your name in there. I love Sung, I love Jenny, I love Diana, I love Mary Jane, all around, you know. I love Steve. That's the historical understanding of death. And so this person that he loved, first time that phrase is used in John's gospel. Look at verse 4. This begins to address this whole issue of indifference. When Jesus heard it, he said, this illness doesn't lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. You know, that is almost the last thing you want to hear. If you've had to bury someone that you love, you probably don't want someone from your church to come over and say, you know, They died for the glory of God. That's probably not the right thing to say, even though it's true. That's the cosmological understanding. But when you're trying to care for someone who is in the middle of grief, you err on the side of the historical understanding of death. This is a specific person that died. You wait till they're through the stages of grief to deal with the cosmological. People don't have the ability to deal with that bigger understanding when they're putting someone in the ground that they love deeply. Hopefully we understand that, right? But he refers back. It's the same that happened in chapter 9. Remember chapter 9, this man that's born blind, and his disciples said, who sinned? Is he blind because he sinned or because his parents? And what's Jesus' response? Neither one. This blindness occurred so that you might see the work of God. When I restore sight to this man, God will reveal himself through this healing, and you might have the revelation of the nature and character of God. That's why this has happened. And that's what he's beginning to say here. It's not indifference. This particular death of this man Lazarus is an opportunity to show the glory of God. How does the glory of God appear? By revealing itself. And we won't see this till next week, but through the resurrection, you know how the story's going to end, right? Lazarus will be resurrected. But the glory of God will come through that. So it's not indifference. Now look how crucial verse 5 then is. If he says this in verse 4, and then he says in verse 6, let me read that first actually. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Really? Your friends who have told you that the man you love is ill, and then you wait 2 days? Is that indifferent? Is that harsh? Don't you care? Where are you, God? Where are you? That's why verse 5, coming in between verse 4 and verse 6, is so crucial, because it answers the question whether Christ is indifferent. It's an apparent. It appears to be indifferent, but it's not. Why? Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Notice two things there. First of all, he names all three. He doesn't say, Jesus loved these people. He said, no. He loved Martha. He loved her sister Mary. He loves Lazarus. They have a name. And when he said love, and you all know this, different words for love in the Bible, this is agape. This is the love of God. Now Jesus agaped Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. That's what answers the question, is this indifference? Does God care? Where is God in the midst of death? And then verse 6, coming back to that, he stayed 2 days longer. That's intentional. Now, friends, you know this from reading other parts of the Bible. If Jesus does something that's intentional, one of the conclusions, because you've read the rest of the book, one of the conclusions you're led to is there must be there must be a greater purpose than what's on the surface. Because if he waits 2 days, knowing whatever else you know about Jesus, then you're left with this thought, well, it doesn't make sense. It appears that he's indifferent and doesn't care, but based on what else I know about him, he must have a greater purpose in mind. And he does. One is his own glory, but the other part of his purpose is and this is what death does. It shows us our need. And we're going to talk more about this in the weeks that are ahead of us. But part of this cosmological understanding of death is It's not the only thing that death does. Why did God say to Adam and Eve, now you're going to die? One was he had to be consistent with his original command, but he also wanted to let them know now they have a big need. Now they know that what did Satan say to Adam and Eve? If you eat this, you'll be like God. What did they find out? So they went ahead and ate. What did they find out? They weren't like God. It was a lie. As we've said so often, there's one God in the universe. It wasn't Adam and Eve. It's not me. It's not you. And once I acknowledge that, and what is one of the best ways to understand that I'm not God? I die. You've probably known people like this. I sure have. I've got a list this long of people I've worked with through the years that act like God, think they're God. And I've conducted a lot of funerals for people who, to their dying day, thought they were God. And you know what the ultimate answer is? They die. They're not God. That's what happened to Adam and Eve. And so part of the apparent indifference is to drive us to the point where we acknowledge there's one God in the universe and it's not me. Now, in God's grace, he goes on now. The second point is he gives this explanation that really is unexpected. Look at verse 7 and 8. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Interesting, this is the last time in John's gospel that his disciples call him rabbi. From now on through chapter 21, when they address Jesus, they address him as Lord. Why? Because they're growing in his understanding. Up till now, they say, well, we're following a rabbi, which is legitimate. He's a teacher. But as they grow, and it took the death of Lazarus and his coming resurrection, ultimately the death of Jesus and his resurrection, because chapter 11 is just a preview of Christ's own coming death. We're going to see in a couple of weeks. They are understanding now, oh boy, we're dealing with somebody. He's a rabbi, but he's not like any other rabbi, right? Because every rabbi we've ever followed dies, stays dead. This rabbi dies, conquers death. Big difference. Secondly, verses 9 and 10, Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. The understanding in the first century, it was not far off modern day science. They weren't real precise. They didn't have stopwatches and cell phones and wristwatches, and they didn't have Greenwich Mean Time. John and Susan were in England. I don't know if you went to Greenwich or not, where the GMT is right there on the Thames River. You know, you can see that, where the whole world is just obsessed with clocks and time management. But essentially they said, well, there's 12 hours of light, 12 hours of day. Now that might kind of seem dinosaur-like. Actually, it's not. Because this Saturday, first day of fall, autumnal equinox. What does equinox mean? Equal night in Latin. Equinox is night in Latin. In a couple of days, sometime next week, I don't know exactly when it is, it's a term you don't hear. You hear equinox a lot. There's also a term in Latin in the scientific world called equilux, and that's going to happen next week. What's equilux? Equilux is the point where there's an equal amount of light, equal amount of day. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of day. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. That's true even for 21st century people. How did Jesus know that? Well, he did create the whole thing, right? And he says that during these 12 hours, and it's a little bit symbolic, he's already said that he's the light of the world. And he says during the light, you cannot, the reason that he is not afraid to go back to Judea where they're trying to kill him, he said, listen, I'm the light of the world. No, I control the timing. I control timing, light and darkness. Nobody's going to kill me until it's the right time. And it's not the right time yet. My hour has not yet come. And then he makes this second application. He says, but you have the same issue. If anyone, not just me, if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, the light is not in him. And so you too have to walk. You too have light. You have the opportunity. That's what life is. The disciples also have their 12 hours. I think we've said this before. I can't remember. It's been a long time, but it's something I try, depending on the funeral and the family. Whenever I do a funeral, I always, if it's appropriate, I try to share this because I think it's so crucial. If you had to just come up with a simple definition of life, what life is, your life, if you just, what does it mean to be alive? Here's a simple thing, way to see it. Life is taking your turn. Life is taking your turn. You and I each have a turn. You have a turn at life. You were born, and eventually you'll die, and in between your birth and your death, you have a turn. It's your turn. Your parents had a turn. For many of you, your parents are gone now. Your grandparents had a turn. Your great-grandparents had a turn. People in the Middle Ages had a turn. None of them are alive, right? They had a turn, and then they die. And so the question is, what are you doing with your turn? Because you only get one, right? At least in this world, this life. And then look at verse 11 and 13. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus. Now notice it's not my friend Lazarus. It's our friend. It's mutual. Jesus, this is one of the most beautiful. If you don't do this, if you're not, this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it's applicable here. Introduce your friends to your friends. Do you do that? If you have a friend, one of the kindest things you can do, if you make a new friend, introduce this new friend to your old friends. Be a community. Be a family. Even if you don't share blood relation. And that's what Jesus does. Look, Lazarus isn't just my friend. He isn't just someone that I love. He's our friend. And Mary and Martha, the whole family. He's fallen asleep. That's a kind of a euphemism. 18 times in the New Testament that phrase is used, fallen asleep. 14 of the 18 times in the New Testament, it means that someone died. 4 times it means that they literally went to sleep. Well, how do the disciples take it? They take it like one of the 4 times. The disciples said, well, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. So they take it literally. Now, what are they trying to do there? Well, they just told him, don't go back to Judea because they're going to kill you. So actually, they're trying to care for Jesus. They're saying, look, it's okay. If he's just asleep, he's going to wake up. So let's stay here. We're safe here. Don't go back to Jerusalem. They'll kill you. And then verse 13, he had spoken of his death, but they thought he just meant taking his sleep. Then verse 14, Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And then he kind of, in verse 15, he kind of reverts. You almost feel like, oh my, now he's getting harsh again. Now he's getting indifferent again. Because he says, for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. At first glance, that sounds really cold. Is he saying, and he is not saying this, but you have to set this up. Is he saying, this man died and and somehow I'm glad I wasn't there. Oh my, that's really harsh. That's really cold. But you could, at first glance, it might sound like that, but then he explains himself again, like he did back earlier. He says, the reason I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you might believe. So it's for your sake. I'm not being indifferent. I'm not being cold or harsh. I'm caring about more than just Lazarus. This is a historical death of a specific person named Lazarus. I'm trying to help you to understand the cosmological understanding of death, that it involves all of you. There's something greater at stake here than just this specific man's death. I don't know who said this, but I saw this sometime this week. I thought it was really good. I'll just read this. Faith grows as experience verifies the trustworthiness of the one we put our trust in. Our faith, my faith grows, your faith grows when my experience verifies or proves the trustworthiness of the one I put my trust in. So in other words, Jesus is saying all through the gospel, if you put your trust in me, you're going to find out through experience that I'm trustworthy. And then it builds, and it builds, and it builds. That's how faith grows. And also notice what he says to him. Verse 15. For your sake, I'm glad he was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. He's back to the plural. He's not saying, let me go to him. Us. We're all going. Also, the other thing that's really fascinating here, he doesn't say, let's go to his sisters. That's interesting because actually the primary characters in chapter 11 are Martha and Mary. It's not Lazarus. Lazarus doesn't say a word in chapter 11. We see him come out of the grave, and we'll see that next week. But actually the primary personalities here are these two sisters. And Jesus says, even though they are, we're not going to see them, we're going to see him. And then you begin to, it's a little bit of a mind twister. He said, wait a minute, you just told us he's dead. And yet you say in the present, we're going to go see him, present tense. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Cosmological understanding of death. When Lazarus died, and this is probably true of whoever you've buried most recently, your assumption, and it's a legitimate one, is your loved one is now separated not only from you, but from all of from life. And that's legitimate as far as it goes. The point Jesus is making here, we're going to go see Lazarus. He's almost saying, Lazarus is no longer alive as you understand it, but do you think Lazarus has escaped me? I'm going to go see him because he's still under my domain. The Father gave me the keys to the kingdom of life and death. So we're going to go see him because I still know where he is and who he is. Last point here. There's an understandable response. Verse 16, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Who would you probably, whatever else you know about the Bible and the disciples of Jesus, who would you probably have expected to say that? Peter. Didn't take you long, did it? Yeah, me neither. It's interesting in John's gospel that the last time Peter was mentioned was chapter 1, verse 42 to 44. He won't be mentioned again to chapter 13 in the foot washing. So John basically covers 3 years of Jesus' life, never mentions Peter. And in the moment that you would think that it would take someone like Peter to say, well, let's go die, it's Thomas. And how is Thomas always portrayed in the Bible? As the doubter, the one with this morose, melancholy personality. And yet in this moment, he has the capacity to rise up and to lead the rest of them and said, well, let's go. Let's go. If he's going to die. Now, his understanding, it's an understandable response because of what we just read. He still thinks Lazarus is, Jesus said he died, but, and he knows there have been death threats back in Jerusalem. So his understanding, it's understandable. It's still limited. But at the same time, you have to commend his understanding because it's courageous, it's bold, it's communal. Let's do this. Let's go together. Notice he says, let us also go that I may die with him. No, that we may die. We're in this together. We're in this together. Now, in one sense, they will die with him, and you probably know the majority of the 12 disciples were eventually executed for their faith. But in another sense, none of the disciples could share the same. Jesus' upcoming death was unique, right? It was for the sins of the world. So in one sense, we can physically die. Nobody can share what Jesus went through. And Thomas is kind of in that realm of understanding, learning to understand this, right? Now, just kind of drawing this to a close, I want to go back just to verse 10, just for a moment. If anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Notice that what he says there, what he doesn't say. What he doesn't say is because this person stumbles because they have no light. He says, in contrast, he says, no, the reason they stumble is because there's no light within. And what he's pointing out there, as we draw this morning to a close, is, and we've said this so many times, our problem, the human condition, is not an external problem. It's an internal problem. Our problem is inside, not outside. As we said last week, every human being that has ever lived is God's creation. So every human being you meet this week deserves respect, deserves dignity, deserves kindness. Make the list as long as you want. But if you're going to be a Bible-believing follower of Jesus Christ, then you also have to add to that, and it breaks your heart sometimes because sometimes you're having to say it about people that you deeply love. Even though we're all God's creation, we're all God's creatures, we are not all God's children, because the only sons and daughters of God are those that have put their trust in Jesus. And so the light needs to be from the inside out because of his light that shines on our souls and redeemed us, right? So Jesus, what he's doing here with this whole understanding of, and we'll unpack this more next week, but this idea of the cosmological understanding, the historical understanding, really what he's doing here, and this is why the title of the sermon this morning, it's a surprising response because most of us just get stuck on the historical, right? I do, you do. I think about all the people I've loved in my life that are dead, and I grieved over, some of them I still grieve over. I miss them.